our topic today, and that's amaranth. And so I'm very, very excited about today's lineup. We do have our co-host, Rocky Mountain Farmers Union, Dan Hobbs, here too. And we will be co-hosting this session today, but we're going to kick it off with Dr. Turner. And Dr. Turner is an anthropologist, and she's been focusing on the Puebloan culture, particularly in the Chaco Canyon in New Mexico. But then her postdoctoral work was at Crow Canyon Archaeological Center in Cortez, Colorado. And her focus, just when I recently sent you the paper on amaranth, was amaranth. So we are just very excited in hearing more. Michelle's PhD comes from Binghamton University, and she's now working in a museum focused, I assume, on ancestral collections. She's at the Mystic Seaport Museum in Connecticut. So Michelle Turner, thank you so much, Dr. Turner, for joining us. I have not met you, so I'm just very excited in hearing your presentation and what you have to share today. And we're going to switch our gear afterwards and put it into the perspective of amaranth production. And we have the Jones family from Nebraska with us today, and we'll be moderating their presentation to put amaranth into a new light. So thank you also, Aubrielle, for bringing your family on and being with us today. So I think Sean can help Dr. Turner to get ready for a screen share, and we can probably get going. Feel free to write questions in the chat while Dr. Turner is presenting.
Yeah, there we go. Looks like it's coming through.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much. I am so excited to be here today and to be talking to you about amaranth, my favorite topic currently. I am an archaeologist who focuses on, I guess we'd call it the desert Southwest, northern New Mexico, Southwest Colorado. And I'm not a farmer, and I'm also not, didn't start out as an expert on plants. That's not exactly what my training was. However, I did an excavation a few years ago at Aztec Ruins National Monument in northern New Mexico. And just by happenstance, we found some amazing seeds, and they turned out to be one of the most amazing parts of that research. So this actually has recently been published in a big archaeology journal. Definitely not just my work. I do want to say that there were other experts, my co-authors, who actually did a lot of the analysis, but I wrote most of the paper, and the site was my research, my dissertation research, so to get my PhD. So I'm super excited to be talking to people who are farmers and deal with these seeds in person. I'm super excited to hear from Aubrielle and her family about their experience with amaranth. I know that I'm coming at it from a different perspective, but hopefully it will be interesting and we can have some dialogue about it. Okay, so let me give you a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about. I'm not going to do a deep dive in archaeology today. I'm going to focus on the plant because I know that that is what you are interested in. So I'll talk a little bit about sort of the area we're talking about and what archaeology is. I'll then turn to what I know about amaranth, what I've learned from this research, what our excavations involved at Aztec Ruins National Monument, how we study ancient seeds, and the significance of our find. All right. I'm assuming that everybody can see me, can see the slides okay, and can hear me okay, right? Okay, great. Okay, so what is archaeology? Good starting point. Archaeology is the study of material remains left by humans in the past. So we study human culture, usually in the past, remains, including architecture, including sometimes human remains, tools, animal bones that people left after they ate the animals. And more recently, there's a real interest in seeds and plants that people used in the past. So to give you a quick overview of the areas we're talking about, I just have this little map here. Let's ignore the green part, the Mogollon. We're going to be focusing today on the Ancestral Pueblo region of the Southwest. So, sorry. Okay, so here's Colorado, of course, you all know that. This is the Four Corners region. This is kind of where I'll be focusing. Chaco Canyon is near the New Mexico-Colorado border, and the site that I'll be focusing on, Aztec Ruins National Monument, is actually even closer up here. So it's really just over the border in New Mexico. I am going to mention the Hohokam region, which is sort of Phoenix, Tucson, southern Arizona. And the time period we're talking about is around 1000, 1100 AD, unless I say otherwise, okay? Everything is AD unless I mention that it's BC, okay? And to be clear, we're talking about Ancestral Puebloans, and they are the ancestors of the Pueblo people who are still around today, of course. Vibrant cultures in Arizona, New Mexico. The Rio Grande is the big center. There's also Hopi over in Arizona, SUNY, all the Pueblos. So this is their ancestors. And in a lot of ways, a lot of what archaeologists learn about the past is kind of informed by what we learn from their descendants today. Okay. Oh, that is not good. All right. So talking about amaranth, I'm going to focus on domesticated amaranth, but I do want to mention wild amaranth, sometimes called pigweed, and certainly in modern Western monocropping seen as a problem, as a weed. You all are probably familiar with Palmer amaranth that is sort of spreading wildly through the Midwest and the Eastern US. I believe it's actually native to the Southwest, and it's seen as a huge problem, and it's becoming resistant to Roundup. It's been described as a superweed. And all of that sort of reflects how people have thought about wild amaranth in our culture. But I think people in the past thought about wild amaranth very differently. So when we excavate at sites in the Southwest, we always find wild amaranth seeds, and people were eating it. It was an important part of their diet. And partly because it comes up early in the spring and the leaves are edible, you can eat that, long before your crops are actually ready. Okay, but we're going to focus today on domesticated amaranth, and domestication changed the plant significantly. So I've got two pictures there on the right. So the little green one on the left is a weedy amaranth that was growing in my backyard in Cortez. The amaranth on the right is a Hopi Como amaranth, and I think you can immediately see that that plant on the right is going to just have a lot more seeds, a lot more flowers, a lot more leaves also, just a different kind of plant. So what we see with domesticated amaranth is that the seed size has not changed significantly. So with other domesticated seeds like wheat or barley, if you compare the domesticated seed to its wild ancestor, the seed is going to be much bigger. That's a big thing that people were selecting for, is bigger seeds. That is not the case with amaranths. The domesticated and wild seeds are pretty much the same size. The big difference is in the seed quantity. So that is what people were really selecting for, more seeds. Flower color, there's huge variation. A lot of that came after the Spanish came to the Americas and got amaranth, and it sort of spread as a decorative plant for people's gardens. But flower color is also something that's been selected in domesticates. And then seed color. So most domesticated amaranth seeds are light, white, pale. That's a picture at the bottom of some domesticated amaranth seeds. And that color is recessive, which means that people selected for it. The fact that the domesticated seeds are usually light or white, it seems like people actually chose that. And it's an interesting question why, and I might talk a little bit about that at the end of the talk. Okay. But it's also an important question. We don't know exactly what people were selecting for. I, as an archaeologist especially, because all I ever find is seeds, we tend to assume that people are interested in the seeds. All of us are interested in grains, so we assume that they're interested in the seeds in the past too. But with this plant, you can eat the greens, you can eat the roots. The flowers are usable in different ways. So it could be that they're selecting something very differently than what is important to us today. So there are 3 domesticated amaranth species, and they are all native to the Americas. Amaranthus hypochondriacus was domesticated in Mexico. It's known to have come to the Southwest before the Spanish. And I'll talk about the archaeological evidence in a bit. That's sort of your grain amaranth, and an example on the left there, Amaranth, New Mexico. So this is grain amaranth grown primarily for its seeds. On the right is an example of Amaranthus cruentus, which was domesticated further south in Mexico, but also a Mesoamerican plant. And Western science tends to call this a dye amaranth, which doesn't sound like something that you'd want to eat, but actually they're completely edible. But the only difference is that it has the red flowers. And so people in the past have used, and today continue to use, dye amaranths, red amaranths, to dye food. We don't have a lot of evidence of them dyeing fiber in the past, but I believe it is possible to dye fibers using dye amaranths. And those dye amaranths, there's no really solid evidence of that being here, before the Spanish arrived. I will not be surprised if we find out in the future that it actually was here in pre-Columbian times. Okay, the third domesticated amaranth species is Amaranthus Kardatis, which was domesticated in the Andes and is not part of my discussion today. No evidence that that was here. Amaranths, of course, there's so many varieties. After the Spanish arrived, they took it around the world. It became ornamental flowers with these beautiful colors and also beautiful names. I think one of these is Love Lies Bleeding. One of them is Princess Feathers. So as ornamentals, it's gone around the world, but also as grain amaranth. There are now varieties of grain amaranth in India and elsewhere, all over the world, that people grow and consider to be their local amaranth, but they all came from the Americas to start with. It is, of course, a super nutritious food. The roots, the greens, and the seeds are all edible. The flowers also edible, but frequently used as the food dye. The greens are full of vitamins, vitamin C, manganese, magnesium, phosphorus. The seeds have a really high protein content, and it's one of those plants that provides things that corn does not provide. So for people like the Ancestral Puebloans, who were very much dependent on corn as a big part of their diet, this fills that niche and makes it a complete diet, which you wouldn't otherwise have. So it's a great supplement to maize, and that's exactly how people have used it in the past. More calcium than other major cereals. And of course, it's also drought resistant. It's easy to grow. It grows, the wild version, at least in my backyard, grows like crazy. And my sense is that is true of the domesticates as well. Easy to grow, easy to harvest, easy to winnow, all those things. One of the things about the domesticated amaranth that is different from the wild amaranth is that the bracts have sort of softened, so you can just rub the seeds out with your hands without prickling them as much as you would with the wild amaranth. Okay, and because of all of these factors, it's one of the ancient grains that people have talked about, and really the kind of grain we need to be thinking about in the time of climate change. The areas that I'm going to be talking about today where we have found evidence of domesticated amaranth are places like, southern Arizona and northern New Mexico, which are dry, and also hot. So definitely something to think about for climate change. All right, archaeologically, what we know about wild amaranth, wild and domesticated amaranth. So the wild amaranth seeds, as I mentioned, are everywhere in southwestern archaeological sites, probably even more than maize, but they are hard to identify really precisely, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. They were clearly domesticated in Mesoamerica and then made their way up into the Southwest. And they were domesticated a long time ago. So in Mexico, the Amaranthus hypochondriacus is at least 1,500 years old. And the Cruentus is at least 6,000 years old. And I'm talking about the domesticates and when they were domesticated. There have been a few samples of domesticated amaranth found in early Arizona sites. So at a Hohokam site near Phoenix, that was dated to 1000 to 1150 AD. They found charred seeds in a bowl that they were able to identify as domesticated amaranth. There have been other finds other places in Arizona, including a cliff dwelling in Tonto National Monument. But amazingly, it's not just in the Southwest. It actually made its way across what is now the United States and has been found in Arkansas, in a rock shelter. They actually found the whole plants, whole flowers that had dried in this cave in Arkansas. What we have not had before is any evidence of domesticated amaranth in the Four Corners, so in northern New Mexico, southern Colorado, and that's what my research has revealed. So I mentioned that it was domesticated in Mesoamerica, and I think there is a long history of human relationships with this plant in Mesoamerica, Mexico, and other parts of Central America. So the site on the left, Monte Alban, I believe it dates from about 500 AD. There is actually a human skull at that site that was covered in turquoise. It's a beautiful, kind of scary object. But an interesting thing about it is actually the glue that they used to glue the turquoise onto this object was actually an amaranth paste. So even at that time, amaranth was there and probably something ritually important. This skull is not just, it wasn't just a glue. I think it meant more than that at that time. On the right, that's a drawing of the last Aztec emperor, Moctezuma, who encountered the Spanish, was killed by the Spanish. And the Spanish wrote a lot about what they encountered and what they saw there. And one of the things they wrote about was amaranth. And amaranth, so that emperor collected as much amaranth in tribute as he did corn. So it was just a huge part of Aztec agriculture. After the Spanish arrived, they really saw it as related to heretical sort of rituals, and they actually suppressed people from growing amaranth. And I think that that has really had an influence, not just in Mexico, but maybe also in New Mexico and up in our region. That Spanish disdain for growing amaranth, I think, really affected how we think about it. All right. But there are people in Mexico who still grow amaranth and use it a lot. If any of you have ever been to Mexico at certain times of year in particular, you've probably had alegría cakes made out of amaranth. I'll talk about those a little bit in a minute too. But there are also people, so this group, the Wixárika in, let's see, I guess we'll call that West Central Mexico, they have just a thriving relationship with amaranth to this day. They have a whole mythology about amaranth. They have a deity who is called Amaranth Boy, who is actually the one who went and got maize and brought the corn maidens to the people. They name people for amaranth. They eat both wild and domesticated amaranth, but understand very much that you have to keep them separate or they will hybridize. They also use amaranth for various rituals related to when they build a new building, that kind of thing. So in certain pockets of Mexico, there's this really rich ritual life surrounding amaranth. And I think that before the Spanish came, that was probably more broadly practiced in Mexico and maybe even elsewhere. In our region in the Southwest, there's a lot of evidence from when anthropologists first arrived in the late 19th and the early 20th centuries. They wrote down what they were seeing, and they were seeing amaranth. So the Zuni had clearly a grain amaranth. It has this great name, which means many seeds. They ground those seeds up and mixed it with maize to make little balls, which they then steamed to make mushes. Basically, they're fortifying their maize with amaranth, as I mentioned, to get that full dietary package. The Hopi in Arizona also grew a dye amaranth, and they used it specifically to make a red flatbread. Peaky bread, if any of you have ever tried that, is often blue, but they also had a red version, which they used the amaranth for. At Zuni, they also grew a dye amaranth and made a red flatbread with it. And San Ildefonso Pueblo is the other place where it was documented in that time period. Zuni women also sometimes used red amaranth to dye their cheeks for ceremonies. And there's also evidence that the Paiute and other Arizona groups also had domesticated amaranth. Actually, when John Wesley Powell came to Arizona, he came back with a bag of seeds, and it included domesticated amaranth that he had gotten probably from the Paiute. Before I move on to the archaeology, I know everybody's always curious about cooking with amaranth, and maybe you all know more than I do. I hope to hear more about that later. One thing I do know is that you can make really delicious little cakes out of it. So amaranth, I guess you can stew it just like quinoa. I haven't actually done that, but you can also pop it, and then it has this, this fun nutty texture. And you can make these little alegrias, which are basically just honey and amaranth. You can also put in, sunflower seeds and other delicious things. And these are cakes that are made in Mexico traditionally using amaranth. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about my project at Aztec Ruins. So again, Aztec Ruins National Monument, the very, very northern part of New Mexico, just over the border from Colorado. It was occupied from around 1070 to about 1275 AD. Despite its name, it was Ancestral Puebloans, not Aztecs. This has nothing to do with Aztecs. That name was basically, white people coming along and thinking that the native folks nearby couldn't possibly have built these structures. It's kind of a leftover colonialist name. So Aztec Ruins has 3 great houses. If any of you have ever visited them, you probably saw this structure that I've got pictures of here. It's called Aztec West. It's the one that you can actually walk through. It's amazing. It's got like 400 rooms. It was 3 to 4 stories high in different places. It's beautiful stone masonry, just an incredible structure. And that's what we call a great house. This was part of the Chaco Canyon system, for any of you who are familiar with that. I'm not going to say too much about it, except that we think that this was a time when, people who before had just been building little farming villages, they suddenly start building things like this. And it seems like what we're seeing is elites who are able to get other people to do work for them somehow, maybe because they have magic or ritual or because they're redistributing food. There's lots of different theories about how they get people to do the work for them, but it does seem like suddenly there are people with power. Aztec, interestingly, is sort of the political successor to Chaco. Chaco sort of goes into decline after 1140, and Aztec keeps going for almost 200 years, and then everyone leaves for the Rio Grande and other places at that point in the midst of a really bad drought. Quick map. So this is the location. So this is the 4 corners up in the left top corner, and Aztec Ruins right here. Chaco is a little bit further south, but this is still northern New Mexico. Aztec is in an area, I like to call it the Tota, which is a Navajo word that means the place where three rivers connect. And that sort of gives you a sense of what this place is like. It is a dry landscape, but it's got these three rivers coming through it, and they're all mountain-fed rivers coming down from Colorado. So there's water year-round. Aztec West was excavated extensively in the early 20th century by Earl Morris and his wife, Anne Axtell Morris, who doesn't get enough credit, I think. It was, an extensive, big excavation, and there hasn't been anything on that kind of scale since then. But because it was the early 20th century, they didn't have all of the tools and methods and technologies that we have today. And in particular, they were not paying any attention to things like seeds. So in my excavation, it was very important to me to pay a lot of attention to what people were eating at the site. So this was a dig that happened, 2016. This was my dissertation research. We were up there for a month. It was a relatively small excavation. I should say this is not at Aztec West. It's at a different great house that had never been excavated before. And there were lots of research questions that I'm not even going to talk about today. We were not looking for seeds. We were really more interested in architecture. But this is you never know what you're going to find once you put a shovel in the ground. So we were digging inside a building. It might not look like it, but those are the bases of walls that you're looking at there. So we're in rooms inside a building. So archaeobotany is the name we use for studying human relationships with plants. It is often the study of seeds. Archaeobotanists are people who spend years learning how to identify different plant seeds under a microscope when they're not in good shape because they've just come out of the ground. Archaeologists are interested in seeds that are cultural, so not just the seeds that fell in or blew in the wind, but seeds that we can actually say people used. And that, by the way, on the right is a corn cob. It's a very burnt corn cob that's about 1,000 years old. Seeds don't preserve well. We tend to only find them in a couple of instances, sometimes in very dry conditions, sometimes in waterlogged conditions, but mostly we find seeds because they've been charred, which means they're burnt, which means they fell into the fire as somebody was cooking. That is where we find seeds, or else, they burnt and got thrown out and then they preserved. Charring basically takes a lot of the water out of the seeds, and therefore they preserve better afterwards. Usually we only find seeds, but sometimes there are other plant parts like the corn cob there. But it's important to notice that, even if all we're finding is seeds, that doesn't mean that's the only part of the plant they were using. And in fact, they might not have been using the seeds at all. They just came with the other parts of the plant and fell into the fire. So archaeobotanists study processes of domestication, but also what we find often is that even when there is a lot of domesticated food, when people have corn and other domesticated foods, they continue to use wild plants. So the process that we use to collect the wild seeds is called flotation. So basically, as we're excavating at every level, we collect a bag of dirt, and literally just a paper bag full of dirt, which we set aside and deal with after the excavation. So after the excavation, my friend Nikki and I use this flotation machine, which is basically just a bucket with a hose coming in the back. Water is constantly moving through that hose. And what happens is the dirt, we dump the bag of dirt in there, the soil and rocks and other things sort of settle to the bottom, but the seeds float. And then you're able to scoop them into the little, she's got a little mesh bag over here on the spout that is collecting the seeds. And then we put them in the sun to dry. And then eventually Nikki here, who is an expert with a microscope, identified all the seeds that we found at every different level. Amaranth is challenging because those seeds are tiny. They are 1 millimeter. I actually had to go back after she had done her analysis. I had to go back just to photograph them, and just getting them to lie still is a challenge because they're so tiny and staticky. I actually took pictures. So this is the setup with a microscope connected to my computer. So you can use that both to photograph the seeds, but also to measure them. So the software measures seeds for you. And we're talking about 1 millimeter or smaller. So you're trying to get it really tiny, a micron, actually, a fragment of 1 millimeter. All right, so here's a picture of the domesticated amaranth seeds that we found at Aztec North. Where we found them, so archaeologists are all about context. It doesn't help me to have an artifact in my hand if I don't know where it came from. And when we excavate a site, we pay attention to where it was, sort of horizontally, but also how deep it was. And things that are deeper are usually older. So in this case, what you're seeing here is the wall of our trench. And I've circled, so this layer right here is the floor of a room. To the left, this was a wall. So what has happened in this room is the roof collapsed. So the roof fall is close to the floor. These seeds came from that layer, which was on top of the roof fall. So the roof had collapsed, but the walls were still there. Somebody actually probably dumped some trash. They moved some trash from somewhere else at the site and just threw it in this room. And it included those seeds. So that's it was a really ashy little layer. And then later the wall collapsed on top and sort of sealed those seeds in there. So that's where it came from. It was after the site probably was not being used regularly because the roof has collapsed. But somebody's still there to dump this trash, right? This stratum, this layer that included the seeds, also included a whole lot of other things, including beads, including obsidian, that little projectile point in the upper left. On the bottom, that's a tool, it's a bone tool that they probably used for making stone tools. We know quite a bit about the date of this layer, and it seems like it was likely around 1140, 1150. It was also full of other seeds. It included corn, but also juniper wood, pinyon wood, ground cherry, bulrush, banana yucca, stickleaf, mountain mahogany, lots of useful plants and edible plants. So studying amaranth is challenging because it's tiny, and also because it's hard to tell apart from other things. Let me explain. So there is another species called Chenopodium, which is a completely unrelated plant, but its seeds look very similar to amaranth, and especially when they're burned. Like I said, usually what we find is burnt seeds. So on the left there is an example of a charred, we call it Keno-am because we actually can't tell it apart. Can't tell whether it's Chenopodium or amaranth. So that is one challenge of studying amaranth. You often can't even tell that it is amaranth. But also, if you can say it's amaranth, it's hard to tell if it's wild or domesticated because size alone does not give you that answer. However, what does give you the answer is the seed color. So you can see up there at the top right, we've got domesticated amaranth seeds, and they are usually, not always, a lighter color, whereas the wild amaranth seeds are going to be black pretty much uniformly. So if you happen to have unburnt seeds, then you can tell whether it's wild or domesticated amaranth. And in our case, we happen to have unburnt seeds as well as burnt seeds in this little stratum. So because we had this unburnt cache of seeds, we were able to tell first that it's amaranth, and second that it's domesticated and not wild amaranth because we had some lighter seeds. So here's a picture of, or several pictures of the amaranth seeds. So basically what the evidence for domestication here is these light brown seeds on the upper left of the picture on the left, because they're not black. Those are domesticated seeds. The black ones, we sort of can't say for sure that those are domesticated amaranth. However, because they're associated with the brown ones, because they're about the same size, we're pretty sure that those are. And then we have a smaller black set of seeds, again, found in the same cache, associated with what are clearly domesticated seeds. We're less sure about those, but we're calling them, probably domesticated seeds. My colleague, Abby Doctor, probably almost went blind looking at seeds and measuring amaranth seeds. She actually measured 90 of the seeds from Aztec North, but then she also did a huge study of almost 1,000 modern amaranth seeds to try to get at whether we can tell them apart, wild and domesticated, using size. She concluded that we cannot. It's all in that paper if you really want to read the details, but lots and lots of work and measuring went into this research. Okay, getting to the significance, and I am wrapping up here soon. So the big thing is that domesticated amaranth is at Aztec North in the mid to late 1100s AD. This is the first domesticated amaranth that has ever been identified at a Chacoan great house or at any kind of ancestral Puebloan site in the Four Corners. It was sort of this lucky find of an uncharred set of seeds that we were able to identify as domesticated. If they'd been charred, we wouldn't have been able to say that for sure. And I do want to say that it's possible that a lot of the seeds that have been found in the past were domesticated seeds, just couldn't be identified because they were usually charred. However, this is a special site. It's a great house. There are special things going on at this site, and I can tell you more about that in the Q&A if people are interested in other artifacts and what's going on at Aztec. But it's possible that we're seeing it here because this is a special place, and at a time when Aztec is really becoming a center of power after the Chacoan decline. And this is another Mexican item. In the past, archaeologists have found cacao coming up from Mexico. Macaws, maize originated in Mexico. Copper bells, there are all kinds of things that came up through Mexico, and they often came through the Hohokam region. And as I mentioned, domesticated amaranth has been found at Hohokam sites a little bit earlier than this site. So it's very possible that they were sort of the brokers, and things came to them first, and then they made their way up a little further to the ancestral Puebloan world. We have variation. We've got different colors and sizes of domesticated amaranth. And our brown seeds don't look exactly like the white and pale and ivory seeds that of domesticated amaranth that has been seen in the past. So we've added a little complication. And I think that the color is actually really important. I mentioned earlier, geneticists have done some research and found that people really were selecting for color of amaranth seeds. And for those of you who know a little bit about the Puebloan world, color is so important in the Puebloan world and how Pueblo people see the world and in ritual and sort of their daily lives. They have a really complex system of color symbolism. It's different at every Pueblo, but the West has its own color, the East has its own color, the sky, the above has its own color. At Hopi, they grow 6 different colors of corn, and they grow them in part because they need them for different kinds of rituals and for different ceremonies. Different kachinas have different colors that go with them, and they need different colors of corn. So color is a part of agriculture in the Pueblos, and it wouldn't surprise me in the least if that was true for the amaranth as well. So obviously, the red flowers are important. The dye amaranth is important in part because of color. But I think they might have also selected for black and brown amaranth seeds because it was important to them for some reason. I'm speculating at this point, but we do know that I think at SUNY, black is sort of the color of the underworld, something that you might need for funerals and other kinds of rituals. Black is also associated with rain clouds. There's also been some research suggesting that black is a really important color at Aztec. So at Aztec, the beads we find are almost always black, as opposed to Chaco, where they usually have turquoise or white shell beads. There's also some black pottery at Aztec ruins that we don't see anywhere else. So black seems to be just really important at Aztec. So this is sort of the more speculative part of my little talk here, but I think that we at least have to be thinking about why people might be interested in colors in the past. Okay. But the big thing that this research has shown is that there's 800 or more years of continuity in Pueblo agriculture. These were farmers, and they kept those seeds and have continued to grow those seeds and to use them. So continuity in their agricultural knowledge and practice. And hopefully, maybe this will inspire some of you to be interested in continuing this as well. I should say that these sort of Pueblo varieties of amaranth are available now. I have bought seeds from Native Seed Search down in Arizona. So it's definitely something you can get your hands on these days. And that Hopi Como amaranth is definitely becoming pretty popular. Okay, I'm going to stop talking. And I don't know if you wanted to do questions now or at the end.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you so much. That's just fascinating. And your research is so groundbreaking when we think about the first evidence that you identified with your research team in the Four Corners. So thanks for sharing that. I think that it would be wonderful to have a few questions now, perhaps leaving the food questions to the end, because we're actually going to have farmers who have worked and are working with different cereal companies, I think. So let's keep the food questions a little bit out. Are there any seed questions, amaranth seed and historical or archaeological questions?
I might have one question, and I'm sorry if I missed it, if it was covered, Michelle, but just you had the mention of finding the plant, I think you said in Arkansas, where the actual whole plant was there. And it just made me think about one of the fascinating things that I was fascinated by in previous in-person grain schools is that, starting to see this reemergence of seed savers and the care that they're putting into the vessels that the seeds are being protected in. You mentioned pottery and other things. I've heard stories, but I wonder if around this time there was any indication that maybe the plants were being used to transport. Is it the plant itself? Is it being, is the seed in other containers? I'm kind of curious.
So the plants, where they found the actual whole plants, that was in Arkansas of all places. So who knows how they got there. We definitely have found, bowls full of seeds. And sometimes it's a mix of seeds. Sometimes it's corn and amaranth, but it tends to be all domesticated seeds get put together, which is interesting. So at that Hohokam site, it was a bowl of seeds that was sort of upside down on the ground. In another place, there was actually a cliff dwelling. They found, I think it was a skin bag full of seeds, and they were domesticated amaranth seeds. So definitely people are finding ways to store it, and it's sort of one of those things that you treasure and definitely take with you if you move. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Michelle, do you have any suspicion why we mostly have white amaranths now? Was the darkness just too much of the underworld and white sky, or what is the reason why we mostly have white amaranth now?
So I don't think we have a good understanding of that. I think people have speculated that the seed coat is a little thinner when it's white, so it's easier to grind, also easier to get it to germinate maybe. But we don't have a good answer for that. But it does seem like, some people value the white seeds, other people might value different colors.
Yeah, fascinating.
Yeah.
Any other questions for Dr. Turner?
I have a question. So I've worked really closely in that whole area west of Farmington on coal ash contamination and looking at that almost exact cross-section, the geological cross-section. And so it's kind of a tangent, but it was just so precisely what I've worked on too. Have you found that coal ash contamination has affected your research in terms of the types of seeds that are available, or like you only can see certain seeds that are protected in any way? Or I was just wondering about that connection.
Wow, that is a fascinating question, because archaeologists are not paying attention to that possibility and, like our health as we're digging in the ground. So I don't have an answer for you. Usually if we find seeds that are actually ancient, they're going to be pretty deep. So these were, 60 centimeters, so a couple feet down. So they're probably protected from anything like that. But boy, now I have some questions about whether we were safe up there digging and disturbing the soil. And yes, I'm going to go ahead and say, like, this whole area of northern New Mexico, it's oil and gas country, and we're surrounded. And maybe you saw in one of the pictures, there was an oil well, 100 feet away from where we were excavating. And there was actually a day when they're like, you can't excavate today because of the fumes that are coming out of the well today. So good moment to mention that if we want to preserve these kinds of cultural resources, that's a thing that we need to think about.
Yeah.
Yeah, what a pleasure to introduce the Jones family here. I had an opportunity to work with Aubrielle at the Rocky Mountain Farmers Union a number of years ago. She left and moved on to Colorado State University, where Eston is from. Aubrielle, I hope you're enjoying your time up there. We miss you dearly, but we're glad you're back today. And with her, I think is going to be her father, Mike. And at Grain School, when we were still fortunate enough to do this in person a couple of years ago, Aubrielle led a wonderful panel on women in agriculture. And so I wonder, maybe you can bring some of those remarks back into this discussion as well, Aubrielle. I'm fascinated to hear in a family farming context how you guys kind of divide labor and who's responsible for what. But we would love you to step forward here and tell us your family story about Amaranth. And maybe you could start with where you guys are located.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dan. We're so excited to be here. So I'm Aubrielle, and this is my dad, Mark. My dad doesn't do this very often. He sits in a tractor most of the days. So we're going to do it a little differently, where I do have a slideshow, but I'm actually just going to ask my dad questions. He's a wealth of knowledge. And he's a lot better if we ask questions. So I'm going to go through and ask him some questions, and that's kind of how we're going to do our presentation. But I'm going to share my screen if I'm allowed to. Perfect. And we'll start there. But anyways, yeah. So hi, everyone. Again, my name is Aubrielle. I currently work at Colorado State University, but I did previously work at Rocky Mountain Farmers Union, and I traveled all across the state of Eastern Colorado and the state of Wyoming talking to farmers. I loved it. I've been involved in our family farm, I think even before I was born, because I'm pretty sure my mom was there helping my dad stack amaranth bags and clean and things like that. So I've been involved in the farm my whole life. And yeah, I'm involved in numerous things. So the women who are on this call, you know, I'm involved in Annie's project. I'm a facilitator for that program. And I'm also on the board for the Colorado Foundation for Agriculture. And then I did an international program with the World Farmers Organization, where I did policy work with various farmers from around the world at different world conferences to talk about issues in agriculture. So that's a little bit about me. And I think my dad's going to give some background on my mom and dad and start with that.
Yeah, I'm Mark Jones, proud father of Abrielle. My wife Marcy and I operate a 2,500 acre organic farm in Western Nebraska, kind of southeast of Sydney, or northeast. I'm the production manager, and Marcy's the chief financial officer, the chief executive officer, and the business manager. So that's pretty much everything else.
And she couldn't be here today. She really wanted to. My dad actually is in Johnstown, Colorado, where my husband and I live, because the farm doesn't have good enough internet. So we're in Colorado currently, and my mom is back home doing all the work. So, but yeah, so I think my dad's going to give a little history into our farm and production.
My grandparents moved here from Nebraska City, the southeast corner of Nebraska, in about 1920. And my father farmed with him, and he had an untimely early demise when he was 53. So when I was 23, I took over the farm, and it was a time in the 70s of depressed prices and a lot of family farms going out of business. That was part of the reason why we needed to diversify and look at other avenues to save the family farm.
And these are just some pictures. Everything that you see on these slides are pictures of our farm. So we have about 2,500 acres of all dryland farm. And back then they started with amaranth and they had wheat, but now in the production, they do millet, amaranth, flax, hard red winter wheat. And then my dad and my mom did peas and legumes as a rotation to help with nitrogen in the soil. So just to give you an overview of all the different types of crops that we grow.
I guess our rotation is, when we got there, wheat was king, and it was wheat fallow rotation, and that was it. And we introduced some spring crops, so we divided our fields into 3 fields so that we'd have a spring crop, a wheat crop, and fallow crop. And the history of amaranth was really enticing to us. And Michelle, that was a wonderful presentation. I learned a lot, and that's kind of what got us going too. I heard about it in an article in the New Farm magazine. Is this where we're at now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And got some seed from a grower in Kansas that tried a little bit of it, and he's sold the seed for $20 an ounce. So I bought 1 ounce, made a few rows with a cultivator, and wasn't sure how to plant this teeny tiny seed. So I put it in a salt shaker, and that was about the right size. Taped that onto a stick and walked down the rows and hand planted about 1/2 acre. We harvested that by hand, hung it in the Quonset to dry, and later thrashed it all by hand. At that point, we had enough to plant about 15 acres. And after we harvested the 15 acres, we had enough to produce hundreds of acres. So that's kind of where we started.
And these are just pictures, again, of our amaranth crops. You'll see the 2 pictures on the left. I already forgot, but the first one is the green
Corinthus.
And then the other one is hypochondritis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Our first seed was all Corinthus, and it was pretty unruly. It would grow 6, 8, 10 feet tall and put on these big heads, and just beautiful heads. Some of the green and gold, and some were split in the middle with red on one side and green on the other. But they were just too unruly to harvest. So we worked with the University of Nebraska at their Panhandle Station in Sydney, and Dr. Baltensperger selected this variety of Hypochondriacus, and he called the variety Plainsman, and that's what we grow today. It's a medium height, about 3 to 4 feet, and just a lot easier to harvest and grow.
And on the right there, you'll see a bag of amaranth. That's actually this bag. We wanted to kind of bring it as a demonstration because this is almost 3 pounds, and you said it would do 6 acres. So just this much amaranth in this bag would plant 6 acres of crops. So that also goes to show how small this seed is.
You see a few black seeds in there too, and we had a guy came out that wanted to do his paper on chicken feed. He was in that that's what he was studying. And they took the pure black seed, the pigwood seed, and said that there was toxins in it that the chickens would eat for a little while, but then they would quit. With the white amaranth, there weren't these toxins present, and they would keep eating that. So maybe that's why they took out the black seeds. I'm not sure.
There you go. Okay, so I think we'll start with some of the questions for our amaranth production. So Dad, how was the crop suited for the operation and our climate?
Well, it was perfect for our climate because we're kind of dry and hot summers. You can grow amaranth about anywhere, but you can only harvest it in certain places. If it's too wet, or if you have a really long fall where it doesn't dry down, we depend on a late season freeze, and then the plant dries down in the field and we can harvest it and store it that way. If you had to do it while harvest it while it's still alive, you would have to have better drying facilities. We still use aeration to dry our amaranth down, but it's pretty low moisture when we harvest it.
And we're also completely dry land. So one thing that's really nice about amaranth is that it's an extremely drought tolerant plant. And so when we have such dry summers, it thrives. And so I would say that's something that's really beneficial for where we are with the plant as well. What challenges are there with growing amaranth?
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of challenges. Michelle was talking before about different varieties of amaranth. And actually, I've heard that there are 14,000 varieties of amaranth, and most of them have dark seeds. Our buyers want as close to all white seeds as possible. So we have to be really careful with different varieties of amaranth that are growing in our plainsman field. We can do most of this with tillage if it's timely. Our cleaning operation, when we were picking out screens for the fanning mill cleaner, the screen that worked the best was the same. It was made out of copper, but the screen that was made out of steel, it was cross mesh screen. And just the difference between the thickness of the copper and the steel made enough difference where we could capture more of the white amaranth and get rid of the black. Also, machinery that we had to adapt to be able to plant amaranth was a challenge. Like I say, we started with a salt shaker and ended up with a corn planter that was adapted with like an alfalfa seeder box that we could meter out seed a lot thinner, because we only plant about 1/2 pound to 3/4 of a pound per acre. So that's a handful of seed for 16.5 feet for a 1/2 mile.
And I would say too, one of the challenges is the plant is extremely durable, but it can be very fragile in its first stages and in its end stages. Sometimes in a summer or in the spring when we plant it, we'll get a pretty hard rain and then the soil will cake over. And if that happens, it's really, really hard for this tiny little seed to sprout through that hard top soil. So sometimes we have to replant at the beginning. Luckily, you don't have to take a lot of seed in order to replant, but if you have to do it several times, or if it's, our scale is usually between 60 and 100 acres. So, that can take a lot of seed and time. And then at the end stages, my dad mentioned we have to let it freeze before we go in and harvest it. And it freezes and it's extremely fragile. If a windstorm came in or something like that, it could knock out all the seeds of all the heads and all of our crop would be on the ground and we can't get it from there. So that's another big challenge for growing amaranth. But I feel like we rarely saw the wind come through and take all the seed out, but maybe I don't remember those times. But I know you kind of talked about it too, but can you talk about a little bit more on the infrastructure that's needed?
The cleaning equipment is all custom put together. The drying floor in the grain bin, we had to put down a fabric because the seed would just fall through the screen on a regular drying floor. To be able to plant that tiny seed, we use that grass seeder box. Let's see, in the combines, there's quite a bit of chaff with the seed, and so it would pretty much stay in a combine. We used a row head, like a soybean row head, and that seemed to help us out quite a bit. Let's see.
The grain bins, storage.
Yeah, we used regular grain bins, but we had to have custom drying floors.
And it's kind of important to have this storage because if you don't have the storage, there's not a lot of elevators in the area or storage facilities that will take it. And all of our crops are certified organic as well. So we don't have a lot of, people in the area who are doing similar things. So storage was huge for us, and making sure it's dry and clean. And, a lot of the markets that we sell with are all, amaranth is a gluten-free grain. And so a lot of times when we worked with companies that wanted it because of the gluten-free side, they would say there can't be any cross contamination. And so we had to be really careful with that and storage too. So, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I think we've grown amaranth for 35 consecutive years. And I kind of figured out how many pounds we raised over those 35 years, and it's probably about 2.5 million pounds that we've cleaned, bagged, and sold.
And we started with little 50-pound bags, and we shipped that to Japan, Germany, Arrowhead Mills in Texas. I know my dad's going to talk a little bit more about markets here in a second, but we started with 50-pound bags, and now my dad uses totes. So he has, huge tote bags that just get loaded onto pallets. But when I was little, that was how I got really strong, was I would lift these 50-pound bags onto pallets and we'd wrap them up and put them into storage. So that was always fun. But yeah, and again, we're on a very large scale. So, for folks doing this on, maybe 1 acre, maybe in their backyards or something like that, it looks very different, but the cleaning and storing process can really be very, very similar across all levels. But yeah, we have, how many acres do you feel like of amaranth have we grown at a time?
At one point, we grew 500 acres in a year.
Yeah. So
that was a challenge.
So it's a very large scale. So one of the questions was about the markets and, what do our markets look like? Do you want to touch on that a little bit?
When we first bought the seed from Kansas in a 1-ounce bag, they mentioned Arrowhead Mills in Hereford, Texas, was interested in buying amaranth. So that was our first contacts, and they were our biggest buyer all through those 35 years. We would look on cereal boxes. This was all before the internet was even around. And we would look on cereal boxes and find companies and try to contact people and get to their research and development teams and tell them what we had and what they could do with it. We attended a lot of different symposiums and went to Robert Rodale's research farm in Kutztown, Pennsylvania. I was one of the grower panelists at that convention.
Yeah, and we've sold to places like I mentioned in Japan. They would kind of use it as an alternative to rice, and they'd grind it down to flour and use it as a flour. We've sold to a lot of mills, so Arrowhead Mills that was mentioned. In most recent years, though, we haven't been selling amaranth, but we have, Ardent Mills is interested in gluten-free grains, and I feel like amaranth is one of those that is coming up. And then in just the last year or so, we've had a few people just from my previous work with Farmers Union who are related to like the brewers and distillers world, because they want, gluten-free product. And so amaranth could be something that they could use to brew beer with, or, spirits. So those are kind of the more recent ones. One of the big ones, but we didn't actually sell amaranth to them, was Kashi cereals. So my family was on the back of the Kashi Cereal Box back in 2011, I think it was. And it was fun. We got to go to like some of the fairs that they did, and we got to talk about our farm to people who were just coming by to get samples and things. So that was really fun. And yeah, we were on the back of their cereal box to kind of tell our story, and they came to our farm and saw, the farm to table process of it all. So we thought that was really impactful. And then I think, so the last question that we had on our list for this particularly was what future may look like for growers. The question for us particularly was on our scale level. So
there's a lot of different products that can be made out of amaranth. Vinegar, they produced a vinegar that was really sought after. The puffing, popping, flaking potential of this is good. A lot of smaller companies could start up with this. It's a real niche that we found ourselves in. And I think it has a lot of potential for small to medium sized growers. What was the question?
Just what you think. When we were going over these questions, my dad really just said there's a lot of ways to get into markets nowadays compared to when my parents started, and it's really just finding those niche products and those niche markets, but also having a relationship with people. I mean, something that my mom does is she calls people up. Like we used to have a very close relationship with our brokers, and like we would, have meetings with the CEO, or they would have meetings with the CEOs of the company. And, it's just calling people up or taking those symposiums or visits and really having conversations with people and trying to build relationships. And then, having that product to where if you need this much protein, or, this and this in a seed sample, who do you call? And, my parents just kind of luckily fell into that, which they worked very, very hard to do that. So I think that's what I would add on it.
Yeah, it was an exciting experience, and led us into the organic certification process. Mm-hmm. We were first certified from OCIA. They started out in upstate New York. We met a guy from Montreal that exported amaranth grain to Germany, and they wanted us to be organic certified. So he brought people out from upstate New York, and we certified with them. We were the 707th member of OCIA. So there's thousands of members now. We got in pretty early.
So I know, Dan, you might have some more questions for us too. Sorry if we didn't quite do the structure that y'all were expecting, but these are just some other pictures of the farm. It sounds like we have really fancy things, but we don't. This is my combine. I call her Old Faithful because she never breaks down. And then these are just some of our grain trucks that we haul our grains back and forth from the farm. Down here is actually millet harvest, so how we do the row crops, and we pick them up with the combines. And then this right here is wheat just coming out of the grain truck. And then just a few other pictures. Shameless plug for my farmers union, but I just had a really good picture of the millet head for it, so I put it there. But yeah, that's dumping grain into the drills that we use to plant. This is one of the row heads to take down millet. And then that's not our combine. That's one of the harvesters that we had come through to cut, and that's their fancy things. And then I know there was a few people asking about recipes. I listed a few in this. If anyone wants them, I'm happy to share them. But these are very, very simple, but my mom made them growing up, and I just love amaranth bread, amaranth banana nut bread, and then Michelle, you mentioned the porridge, and that's actually how my family regularly eats it, is amaranth porridge. So I can send those. I know I went through them kind of fast, but we have those if anyone wants them. So that's all we have.
Oh, you guys, that was absolutely fantastic. Just delightful. I love the image, Mark, of you out there with the salt shaker and the breeding project, and looking at the cereal boxes to being on the back of the cereal box. And what an odyssey. Thank you for sharing your story and for doing it together. That was really fun. So we've got a question in the chat here about kind of the basics of planting, the timing of planting, the timing of harvesting. Let's see, process for harvesting amaranth, time frame for planting. How many times a year do you plant?
We usually plant mid-June. It's kind of like millet. And then we have to wait for that hard freeze in late fall, and we'll run out and get as much as we can before the wind takes the rest.
Is it real susceptible to hail?
Oh yeah, I mean, it just shatters so easily.
Yeah.
So.
And you can kind of see it in the stalks too when it's ready to harvest. The plant will actually just kind of, I mean, it will look dead. It just turns brown, but the stalk kind of turns a bright pink. And there's a it's a beautiful, beautiful plant, but there's also kind of a beauty in when you're about ready to harvest it too.
In those old Cortez plants, they'd have a great big stalk about 2 inches around. And when it would freeze, sometimes they would split and this red juice would come out of them. It just looked like blood. And so I see where they got some of their dyes from.
Being that it's kind of a late plant, I think you said June, the weed competition must be pretty fierce. How did you deal with that?
Mostly mechanical tillage. We would get a look at the weather forecast, and if we saw we were free of rain for a week or so, we'd go out with a rod weeder that takes out all the weeds and makes a nice seed bed, and come right behind that with our planter and hope that we didn't get rained on too hard to crust the ground.
Yeah, it's a timing deal. And what about, I mean, did you have to worry about the native amaranth crossing or contaminating the domesticated variety?
Very much. That's our biggest challenge, is to keep the fields clean of all the other amaranths.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think when my dad, did rotations too, the rotation that he has really helped with weed and pest control. And that's something we do through the organic certification, but I think that helped too. Okay,
I'm going to go through a couple more in the chat here. And Nana and Sean, you tell us when time's up. Can you use an oat roller to flake amaranth, or is there special equipment needed for that?
Yeah, I'm not sure about flaking. If you set them really tight, I suppose it would work. For the puffing, the popped amaranth, a guy in Naperville, Illinois, developed a hot air popper, and he could pop that at the right temperature where it didn't disturb the enzymes in the seed, so that it kept all of its nutrition. But I'm not sure about the flaking.
Yeah.
Probably could. There's a way to do it.
Okay, and here we got another question about insect and bird pressure and/or any diseases.
Yeah, we would have a lagus bug that would come in some years, and they just kind of take the moisture out of the seed and destroyed a lot of seeds. Nothing really in storage that was a problem. That's the only insect I think that we had real problems with. Sometimes we'd get a boar that would go through the stalk and weaken the stalk, and it was more susceptible to breakage during wind event.
And birds do like the seeds. They will eat them if you put them into seed feeders, but we had issues with them coming into the fields, but that's pretty minimal when you're on a scale of, various acres.
Yep. And so this Plainsman variety, was that bred specifically for you guys in conjunction with the research station?
Yeah, I think they got funding. This guy got interested in it. He was heading the research station there. So he decided to select that variety.
And so what if anybody in the group here wanted to get a hold of your seed? Is that possible for us to grow some out?
Sure. We have about 20,000 pounds sitting in the Quonset. So.
Well, if that little bag will sow 6 acres.
And we have one plug for all of this is my dad is on his way out of farming and we have all of this equipment and all of these things, and we would really hate for it to, go unused. So if anyone knows people who are excited and interested in this, we're excited to talk to people about it. And I think my mom and dad's legacy really is something that needs to be carried. And unfortunately, it's not in the cards for my husband and I, but we would really love to see it happen. So